we will have general introduction to the concept of racism. We will analyze the definitions, certain characteristics, and then we'll focus on racism in the United States, which is the main topic for today. We'll have the break, and then after the break, we will have the speaking workshop. If you have questions, let me know. Many of the events and documents that we are going to analyze throughout the lesson are documents we are already familiar with. So we are going to mention them, in some cases we are going to refer to the content and hear what's important in the experience on racism. But we're going to go into detail. But if you have questions, let me know. So we'll start with the definition of racism. And I have included different words and phrases that can help you define racism, but they are not in order. So can you organize these ideas so as to get a clear definition of racism? Probably we could start with saying that it's a set of ideas and practices. How are those ideas and practices related to the rest of the world? These ideas and practices are usually used to divide people into different groups, different races, on the basis of physical features. And I'm really interested in this word, allegedly. And I want you to tell me why you think, as American, I don't know, but why do you think allegedly is part of the definition of racism?
Because it is based in history, in events that happened before, and that idea is still instilled in people's in American science.
Okay. I would say not just in America, but yes, okay. It's because these ideas are rooted in history and tradition. That means that they are not based on science. There's no scientific proof to show that there are certain people can be placed in certain groups. But they are the result of history, they are the result of oppression, they are the result of domination. So, why do you think it's important to mention this less favorable treatment? How is that related to those ideas and practices?
Because the most powerful group feels that the other group should have a less favorable treatment. In a way.
Exactly. So, members of the same group.
And as a consequence of racism, all these practices bring about less favorable treatment to the lower, to the inferior groups, so to speak.
Inferior group rooted in decisions.
So that less favorable treatment is justified
Exactly.
with those inherent characteristics. Those characteristics are the justification.
I would add that they are allegedly the inferior group, they are perceived.
They're perceived in that way, their identity is constructed in that way. So as to justify those practices that in some way justify this inferior position. So what do you think that in this case the word ignorance expressed as in relation to everything we're saying?
As many of these prejudices are based on ignorance. They don't have any truth to them, so they are ignorance is what is causing all of these behaviors and sets of ideas and practices.
Okay, so you know that the author you have to read explains that these ideas and practices are important. These ideas and practices is not the result of ignorance. So many people may not know that they support these ideas and that these ideas position certain groups in a inferior position, but at the same time now we can focus on racism in the United States. You're already familiar with different events and different documents that are related to history. Now, I want you to think of the way in which different events and documents can be related to the topic of racism. So please type the documents, the dates, the events that you think that are related to racism in the United States. Probably you remember Carolina's lesson. She focused on 40s, 50s, 20s. We have analyzed the countries. But what else?
No lo consigue.
Okay. Jim Crow. Thirteenth Amendment, Month of Destiny, the Great Migration.
Do you think you can try to put like a white background or?
No, when it says, when the question ends, I think that you will be able to see it in your cell phone.
Okay, we're going to organize all this.
Maybe you can. Can you now see it in your cell phones?
Okay. Okay, don't worry. So we are, you know a lot of things, and you know most of the better things that we're going to analyze. But we're going to organize that information. So you have a text written by Sandra Fada. Whose title is Black Rights in the USA, a permanent struggle. What do you think that she refers to the race movement in the United States as a permanent struggle?
Because I believe that racism has been an issue. Basically, I believe that it will still exist, and that is why it is the name of permanent. It started in the United States, for instance, since independence, the Declaration of Independence, and nowadays we see cases of racism that makes it permanent.
Okay, so
Basically, almost 300 years after the Declaration of Independence, there are still cases of racism that needs to be studied.
Yes, and although acts and, well, declarations such as the Declaration of Independence have been signed, a lot of them have been hypocritical or controversial, like Jefferson signing the Declaration of Independence and having slaves of his own.
Yes.
It's almost like racism has been institutionalized from the very start of the United States, from its very beginning, historical beginning.
yeah, it's okay with you relate the topic of racism, the Declaration of Independence. I think it's also interesting to say that Fada has an interesting line in the text that says that discrimination was born in the country itself. So if we think of British North America in the 17th century, we can understand why African Americans have been oppressed. And this idea that we have of a permanent struggle is also related to the fact that it is a system of oppression. So there are people who are oppressed and people who oppress and benefit from that oppression. So that is the way to understand why this is still a struggle in the United States and all around the world. So the idea is to organize this
Declaration of Independence, 1776.
And how does that relate to racism?
Because I believe that the Declaration of Independence, it was stated that all men shall be free. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, delivering the just powers from the consent of the government.
Okay. So we have a promise of universal right because of the language that is used, but who are the people excluded?
Yes.
In this case. So we have who are all men.
The white man.
The white men. And what is the issue that is not included in the Declaration of Independence?
Slavery.
Why?
Because they will benefit from them.
Who?
The white man will benefit from.
Adult white men.
Okay, from which part of the country?
The South. The South.
Remember that it was an issue that divided the North and the South, and in order to guarantee the union, it was necessary to omit this part, because the union at that moment was more important than slavery.
And some of them were slave owners.
Exactly. And it's
Jefferson.
yeah. And this slavery was important for the economy.
Yes.
That is basically why it was not included. Okay, we can talk about the following.
The Nationality Act was passed in 1790.
Okay.
This was the first law to determine the eligibility for citizenship, by which some immigrants could become U.S. citizens. But in practice, only white adult men that had property could access this benefit.
So it's any free one person.
Mhm.
So if we move to the 19th century, what is the westward related to racism?
The divine right and the belief that these white men were superior and that they had the divine right to expand and carry with them their knowledge because theirs is better than the rest of the people.
Okay, so, what is the word that comes to your mind when you're referring to the icons?
The Monroe Doctrine? No.
Complex.
Manifestation.
So the westward expansion was a result of this ideological encouragement, but at the same time it was a dynamic opportunity. But let's relate the westward expansion to the issue that divided the north and south, which was slavery. So how do you relate the westward expansion to slavery?
Could be that the acquisition of new land had to be worked by someone, and in those cases, slaves would fulfill that purpose.
Exactly. And at the same time, new land meant new states.
And new economic opportunities
Exactly.
at the same time.
And do you know how it can relate this to Congress? Let's think of Congress.
That there were some part of Congress that was in favor of slavery and the other part against.
Exactly. So there was a balance of power in Congress, and it was important to know whether the new states were going to support slavery or if they were going against slavery. So if this was related to power, because it was needed to know whether slavery was going to be permitted in these states. Okay,
the data are there. The first three are the 13, 14, and the 30th Amendment is about the abolition of slavery. And then the 14th is about civil rights, in which black people were given citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment is about voting rights and giving black people the right to vote.
Let me add something in relation to the 15th Amendment. You mentioned the civil rights, and you referred to citizenship. They correct, but there are like three bullet points that are part of this amendment. Can you remember? Two other rights that were granted.
The right to vote.
No, the 14th.
And the 14th.
The related states have to ratify it.
No, not really.
The government should defend the rights for all men equally, even regardless of their previous status of servitude.
So, in this case, we have, exactly, the right to due process and the right of protection, equal protection and protection. And in relation to the 15th Amendment, it's right, it's related to voting, but what's the problem with this? Because it sounds something good.
They had a lot of conditions for black people that made it difficult for them to actually be represented in the vote.
The founding fathers believed that it was necessary that the states decide the voter eligibility, and this resulted in what?
The internet test.
The voter eligibility was that it was necessary to have white males who had property. So property became an important issue in this case. And once again, the states determined that white people were the ones who could vote. And then we have analyzed the three Reconstruction amendments, but we still have a year there to recognize a year.
The civil rights act.
Again.
It affirmed equality for all men before the law, and it prohibited racial discrimination in public places and facilities.
Okay.
And it also made it a crime for anyone to facilitate the denial of accommodations or services on the basis of color, race, or previous condition of service.
And what happened?
I think it was like, they said that on paper, but that was not shown in practice with the separate by equal,
Something happened before. The third right, and we're going together, but 1883, something happened.
The Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional.
And why? It's related to the content of the 14th Amendment. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that some right to regulate the behavior of states, but not individuals. Exactly. So in this case, it was considered that individuals were their behavior was not something that could be regulated by the federal government. So that's why it falls under the Constitution. And we'll get to what you were mentioning about when sexual equality. But first, what was the reaction to So we have the emergence of white supremacist organizations. Okay. What can you tell me about this picture?
It shows the segregation that they had at the time.
Okay. How was that segregation made?
There were public facilities that were especially for black people and others that were for white people.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And what is the name of those segregationists?
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow.
They were adopted or?
Yes,
And then we have the separate people. What can you tell me?
I think it was, I don't know how to call it, was it a policy or? A doctrine that, was applied to pretend that black people were treated equally, but in actuality, the facilities at least that were provided for them were usually in worse condition than what was for white people. So they didn't really have that equality that was claimed.
and it also has a great impact because it was legal to discriminate against them.
Yeah, to separate
Uh-huh.
on the basis of racism. The thing is that separate was never equal. And I want to mention something that Diana said yesterday, because I think it was interesting. She referred to the fact that it was quite easy to analyze the separate and equal doctrine as something that was negative at the time. Because now we have concepts like racial equality. But at the time, when the separate and equal doctrine emerged, it was 30 years after slavery was abolished. So it's a short time to history, and it's a short time to change the way in which people think. So at the time, many people believed that it was a solution. Maybe we can't see it in that way today, because we know the history of this issue, but it's quite interesting to analyze that they were trying to do something positive for this community, at least in theory. Then we see that in practice, it was not something that could be observed. How do you relate this doctrine to these years?
So the 1896 is the Wesley versus Ferguson case of court. The Wesley versus Ferguson case, they stated that the separate and equal accommodations was constitutional under the 14th Amendment. And the 1899 was that it wasn't unconstitutional because they brought a case about they were trying to close a high school that was for black students. And so I think some parents presented that case to the court, and they said, and the court ended up claiming that it wasn't unconstitutional because they were not trying to open a white school in comparison to the closing of the black school.
So the second ruling reinforced.
It was related to the founding of schools and basically, well, the application of this doctrine. In fact, they believed, white men believed that they were treated equally, those different groups, but in fact they were separated from them.
So, now, the worst thing African Americans experienced racism in the 20th century, during everything in America. So, great extent is one thing.
argument to some extent. You have mentioned many developments that contribute to the
Slavery was abolished, black people now have citizenship and equal protection under the law. They have the right to vote. They have the Civil Rights Act, and they had access to a lot more facilities than they used to before, even though they were not encouraged as the facilities for white people. At least they could access them. It's possible.
Okay. Theory. Okay. What extent is the more expensive
Regreita. Internet a clase. Faltan 14 dispositivos.
Now that you have the arguments, that's why.
Okay, so I stand fine. What do you remember about the situation of African Americans in that period?
I believe that one of the reasons why this possibility to have it chosen is because of the emergence of the KKK, for example, these white supremacist organizations that focus on persecuting and
Yeah,
committing acts of terror against the citizens,
yeah, that's.
the colored citizens.
Yeah.
And also for me, the roaring twenties is more so about the economic wealth and the economic progress. People were having not the progress,
Working opportunities.
yeah, like the affluence of the time. And, like we were just saying, like at least the things that black people could access were not at the same level that white people were accessing. So in that sense, I feel like, at least in economic terms, I wouldn't say it was, they were enjoying they were roaring.
Especially in the South, because the conditions of the South were different from the conditions of the North.
What were the conditions?
The North was more industrialized, I believe, compared to the South.
And in the south, we have, and,
No, come to
no, the segregationist laws that we have in the
Ah,
south.
the Jim Crow laws.
The Jim Crow laws. So we have the Jim Crow laws in the south. And, it's interesting to imagine the economic field, because I agree with you, that what society was one to, benefit the most from this, economic prosperity of the twenties.
The only thing that I could think of the black people, that were for the roaring twenties was the Harlem Renaissance. But
Yes.
Something very important.
yes,
Remember
but,
that when we spoke about roaring, we associated with what?
entertainment.
With jazz. And who played jazz? Black people.
We are going to see that they were trying to build economic capacity. You will focus on some intellectuals who were
Eran pobres. Ah, pero tenían jazz.
of developing.
And also this feeling of pride, of visibility, of recognition of their culture, their identity, because of this cultural movement.
And in this case, the question includes minority groups. And probably you remember that when you study the twenties, you analyze different groups. But throughout this lesson, we're going to focus mainly on African Americans. And if you read the text by Fada, she has an interesting explanation to this, and she explains that African one group per line. Stack A, B, C, and D. And you have to answer the question and prepare a 3-minute presentation answering the question.
Sí, dale.
You will have 15 minutes or 10 minutes probably, to organize your ideas and organize your presentation. You will have to share your presentation with the rest of the class. So it's important that you select the information that is important to answer the question. And then
O sea, esta clase no termina más, básicamente. Lo que me está queriendo decir es que esta clase no tiene fin. Que lo que me quiere decir es que esta clase no tiene fin, faltan 2 chistes diapositivas y encima quiero una presentación de 15 minutos. Déjame hinchar las bolas.
questions related to an important movement that was mentioned. I need a volunteer. Okay, someone from group 1. You have 3 questions related to I don't want to choose someone.
Okay, so when was it, when did it originate, and when was it? We wrote it originated with the Great Migration, and it was a cultural movement. This part, I'm not sure. It could be particularly in the arts, with the aims to create a new identity for the African American.
Yeah, it's fine. It's also related to writing.
But it was interesting, like it emerged particularly or impact mostly in the field of the arts, and then the impact was then broader.
Yes, but I think that it's important to focus on writing too, because then the ideas were spread and there was a way of getting recognition. So yes, the arts is okay, but I think that it's also important to refer to the other areas.
It's a culture, which they communicate.
Communicate is so referred as a cultural revolution, so yeah, I think it's important to mention different areas so as to show the impact. So what can you tell me about the other questions?
Okay. Well, and how is it related to racism? And we were thinking about that it was related to racism because in order to escape segregation in the South, they moved towards the North in looking for new opportunities. And how significant was it for the construction of the African American identity? I stated.
Okay. From the same group, can someone answer the last question? Or the second, if you have the different answer? We referred to the importance of being recognized. So we could relate that to the second question, that is to how this relates to racism. And in that case, we could mention that they were being recognized. And this was the first time that they were being, they were sharing their culture. Because up to that moment, they were considered to be people without history, people without culture. So this was the moment in which they were showing that they have a unique culture.
It altered the public perception of African Americans, although it didn't address the racial inequality.
Okay, so now we can move to group B. And in this case, we have confusions. Someone from.
Yo estoy empezando desde ¿qué dijo?
Can you share your answer?
Ay, va a hablar por mí, tranquila.
Someone from group B. Come on, people. Who was Washington?
Yes, we couldn't cover all of the questions, but I think that to sum it up, we can say that C. Washington and Garvey were separatists. And I don't know how to pronounce allow us for, kind of taking into account, well, equality more than separatism. I think that's the basic idea, but, we wrote down
What
that.
do you mean by separatism?
I remember that I saw that word, written down with, I think it was to Washington. He wrote down that he focused more on practical skills and economic independence rather than, social capital.
I was talking about Washington.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, like he said that, he sustained the ethos of Jim Crow America.
Yes, because he said that it was important to focus on economic development first. And the question of civil rights had to be,
It was like a temporary measure that he wanted to cope with separate but equal by focusing in economic achievements first for African Americans and leaving political and civil rights achievements for later.
I know it's not, also, he thought that if they achieve economic affluence or economic stability like white people did, white people would see them as
that was, he was interested in building the social capital so as to prove that they could have access to civil rights. And it's not that he was, he accepted permanent inequality. It's that for the time being, let's focus on practical skills. Like why he focused on carpentry demand or nursing for women.
But, sorry, Charlie, that is not separatism, but gradualism.
Or accommodation.
The theory was called the accommodation.
And just to like, just to,
Accommodationism.
And in that case, I think it's interesting to read Free at Last so as to get the full picture of this concept. Because it was from the South.
Voy a leer este amigo que tengo.
And that kind of explains why he believed that they needed to accommodate to reality that they were facing in the South. And that is why Dubois criticized Washington because of these ideas of gradualism and accommodation. But this Free at Last is quite an interesting text, so as to get the full picture. And as regards Garvey and the idea of separatism, how do you relate Garvey to separatism?
Somebody wanted to say something when I interrupted.
Yes, no, it was just a comment to add to what we were talking about Washington. He would say that politics was for the mainstream society, but in the 1900s, I think he was the leader of the National Negro Business League, and he funded litigation cases against civil rights. So he was in favor, let's say, of action towards the achievement of racial equality, but he was more discreet in a way until, well, they reached the financial freedom.
Yes, and he was in
Yes, he fostered education
Yes.
more than political education. And he founded institutions related to technical education.
And probably you can compare with the work you're doing to what.
So I have a question because when I was reading the material, it wasn't clear to me if he founded Tuskegee University.
Yes.
Because the title says that when they were talking about it, it said like he was a professor, he was called to teach there or something like that, but they didn't really say that he
He founded, well, yeah,
He mentioned
together with other people.
Okay.
So about the what?
He was against the policy of Washington because he said that he was trying to trade to change the economic rights for political rights, and well, he was against gradualism.
explained the consequences of segregation, lynching, disenfranchisement, and said that the only way to solve racism in the U.S. was through active protest.
Yes, your
And political action based.
Yes.
demonstrations, protests. So those were the keys to fight for civil rights and rights.
And also the concept of the talent stand. What was that concept? Well, you can check and you can.
He emphasized the higher education for developing leadership capacity in African Americans and
Because he believes that it was necessary to develop leaders of thought, which was quite different to what Washington proposed, because Washington said, well, we have to focus on arts and skills. But in the case of Dua, he was interested in
Highly education.
so as to create leaders, political.
These leaders would upgrade.
Assume positions of leadership.
Yes, they would upgrade.
And it's interesting to analyze how Dua and the movement he leader influenced the civil rights movement. Okay, and Garvey. Garvey and separatism is kind of why do you relate Garvey to separatism? He was accused of wanting to send people to African Americans to Africa. He then denied. But what can you tell me about the economic freedom?
He thought that a way to fight this racism was for African Americans to fight, become capitalists, to escalate the social ladder, let's say, so that they can produce, they can be more
It was
wealthy.
necessary to create these. It was necessary to concentrate power and wealth, because that was the way in which whites had damaged. So
Also the idea of creating, let's say, black businesses to foster economic growth from within the community. This idea of economic support from black, to black businesses from black.
Dependent from what?
Yes, exactly.
And I think it's quite interesting to mention that he supported the separation of races. And in many cases, he met with white supremacist leaders. So that was why he was criticized by other African Americans. Okay, so now we can. So we have covered the first half of the 20th century. Now we will focus on the second half of the 20th century. The late 70s, World War II, raised awareness of the conditions of African Americans.
Sorry, I have a question. What is Garvey included in this part where intellectuals were supposed to defend the rights of African Americans? If he was kind of, he wanted African Americans to go back to Africa and that he was cooperating with the supremacist organization, for example.
I would say that it's interesting to analyze how different people support different ideas for African Americans advancement. Because he believed that he was helping African Americans. It's a different way of analyzing things. So that's why I think it's interesting to analyze the full context. So we have the Jim Crow laws and different rights that African Americans were not able to exercise. So in that context, economic development seems to be
theories and different institutions that were created as a result of their ideas.
And it's interesting to analyze how people from the same race, I would say, have different ideas in order to analyze the same experience. So what is what is World War II race awareness? Again. Can you have more information? Okay, so grade 10, what do you remember about this period?
Well, World War I started in 1939. World War II, sorry.
What was the situation of African Americans?
Somehow it was similar to they have been experienced during the war, for instance. They had to endure separation. They had to fight for their own lives, so to speak. They had disadvantageous position if compared to other soldiers, for example.
What were they fighting for?
A country that didn't accept them. A country that didn't accept them.
And who were they fighting against?
Germany. Nazi Germany.
So after the war,
To protect the rights of equality.
To defend freedom and democracy.
to spread democracy, freedom, to free Polish people, Jews. So what's the contribution in this case? They were fighting for freedom.
And the freedom that if they couldn't have.
Exactly. They were fighting for the freedom of other people, but that was not. So,
And even during the Cold War,
Yes.
yes, they were fighting, they were the free
Total.
people, and then what happened?
okay, I should.
¿Tú no ves que estudia?
The real enemies of my people are right here, not in Vietnam. No, I will not go 10,000 miles from here to help murder and kill another poor people simply to continue the domination of white slave masters.
So we analyzed
Falta más.
the end of
Ah,
World War
está
II,
bien.
1945, and this figure was recorded in 1967. 10 years later, as had this changed.
Not that much.
Exactly. So they were still fighting for. So that's why everything was mentioned in Cold War. So what was the claim that was usually mentioned by the Soviet Union in relation to that? Because the United States was trying to position itself as the leader of this new world order. So what was the claim made by the Soviets?
They were saying like they were the land of freedom, but then practice they were.
So they were trying to spread freedom and democracy, but they were unable to guarantee those rights to the people who live inside the country. Okay. Great. So. How
Yo no vi esta clase todavía. Pero yo puse tu aire y leer. Si no, no me lo pondría. ¿Dónde voy?
Regret. Okay, why?
Because it legally ended racial segregation in public schools, and it overruled the separate by equal principle. And was hence with the Leslie versus Ferguson case.
And in this case, what's the field that is related to education? So what is the concession that could be presented in this case?
Yeah, legal.
The rest of the
The rest of
The rest of the areas were not considered. So the prohibition of segregation was only related to public schools. But what's the importance of this rule?
Having established like a precedent for future petitions as regards unrolling the separate but equal doctrine in other fields.
Exactly. And this proved that change was possible. So it's quite an important ruling. So when we focus on the second half of the 20th century, these are the basic facts of the moment. The one we mentioned, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There is a group who has affirmative action. Okay, volunteer to present the answer. It is related to the sector of the 20th century.
Okay, affirmative action were a set of programs and policies that started in the 60s in Kennedy, and then they were expanded by Johnson for executive orders. And these programs aimed at encouraging universities, schools, and business to include minority groups, for example, Black people and also women. And they were supposed to document their hiring and admission processes to prove that they were including women and men in the companies or in the universities or schools. Nowadays, we said that the situation varies because some businesses or mostly universities still have affirmative action, but the Supreme Court has limited the use of affirmative action mainly because it started like a dual controversy because the supporters claim that it led to equality and that society is more diverse now, but there are opponents that claim that it led to diverse reverse racism. Reverse yes, discrimination, yes. And that some good candidates are not being admitted to universities or hired in some positions because they are not black or because they are not women.
Thank you. And it's very interesting to say that President Trump removed affirmative action programs through an executive order. So they don't exist anymore.
In order to meet affirmative action programs, what did companies and schools establish at that time in the 60s? So that is the controversial part. In order to admit students in schools or hire people, the quota. And that is the controversial part, because it could be considered positive and also negative.
And also affirmative action does not establish quota. People, companies.
Companies, the companies and the schools.
And quotas are illegal, so
And some companies hire just these minority groups just to fill the
Well,
To feel like a place or.
and that's where you have the argument of reverse discrimination. You're hiring that person because of the quota and not because
Yes.
that is the person who is prepared. But quotas is an interpretation, so
Yes.
quotas are illegal in the United States. Affirmative action does not say establish quota. Okay. But promote, hire.
But in the end, the programs are removed.
Yes, and quota was the easy way.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, to what extent were these landmarks effective in improving African American Are they effective?
No, después que lo pronto, entonces. Dale, pasan rápido, quiero mi break. Déjame lo soluciono yo.
Are doing improve conditions for African Americans because it removes barriers that prevent them from exercising their right to vote.
It prohibited racial segregation in public schools and education, employment discrimination, each bar all forms of discrimination regarding sex, origin, religion.
The way it completed what had started with ground.
Yes.
And the passing of these two acts repealed the Jim Crow law.
I didn't.
So that's important. And it's important to mention that the Civil Rights Act is the most important act since the Reconstruction Amendments in terms of African Americans. And what can you tell me about if you had to think of the concession? So as a term that they were not. Fully, the adoption of affirmative action programs shows that it was necessary to keep on working on that. So an executive order was needed for us to continue redressing the inequalities that exist. Questions? Okay. So we have covered the second half of the 20th century, and now we focus on the 21st. So someone from Group can you share your answers, which are related to these headlines, and then we have a break.
The first question says, are there certain minority groups who are still discriminated against in the U.S.? And the first thing that we thought about was what was going on today with the deportation and immigrants, and mostly Latino immigrants or Latin or Mexican Americans that are living there. And then how does racial inequality manifest today? What role do state institutions play? We could probably talk about ICE. Well, as we said, that affirmative action is taken away with Trump. That also Trump took away the asylum for immigrants.
And there's also this whole build a wall movement, MAGA movement, the voluntary deportation that if you turn on TV in the US right now, some of the ads that you see are asking illegal immigrants to deport themselves and deport themselves. This whole, the whole thing about detention camps for first generation, second generation immigrants that have lived in the US for their lives and so they know being deported by ICE
they are not trying to be subtle about it. This is open persecution of black people and immigrants, and there's a whole base of voters that want immigrants to die.
So at the beginning, we talked about different ideas and practices that are used to justify this victim. And she referred to the construction of the wall, for instance, which are the ideas that were used to justify the construction.
The entry of immigrants to the country.
Okay.
No, but they bring drugs to the country,
They come and take
negative.
your jobs.
And you could refer to
They're getting now,
and
like, puts in the, like,
this is basically related to trust retard, the way in which it constructs the identity of Latino, for instance. So they are racist, from their ethnic. It's quite difficult to separate racism and integration because the construction, the racist way in which the identities are constructed is related to immigration and the justification for that. But at the same time, remember that this topic, this unit is related to racism and not immigration. So you have different minority groups to be mentioned in this case. So for instance, you have an interesting article related to the inequalities that different minority groups experience today. So you have black people, you have Mexican people, Hispanics, Asians,
Native Americans.
So what can you tell me about these inequalities in today's America?
The article that you have makes a connection between racism and the discrimination these people suffer and inequality. Inequalities in wealth, in health, in education. I don't know if you read the article.
It is in one of the
The last slide that says equality,
Yes.
racial inequality or something like that, and you have the article.
And it addresses different areas, finances, health, education.
And you have different statistics.
But even that you can read that there are examples, statistics and to support your argument, okay, that today racism continues. Inequality continues.